this part of our series for this new semester, which is titled Emerging Horizons of Historical and Archaeological Research in Kenya. So today we are having yet another presentation from a PhD candidate. And today the candidate is Esther Ginestet, I think from France. Esther has a BA from Sciences Po University in France. She has an MA from Sciences Po in France as well. She has another MA from Northwestern University in the US. And currently she's a PhD candidate, both at the universities of Northwestern in the US and Sciences Po in France. Her work generally is an endeavor to explore the modern history of the Nyanza region with a focus on the social and intellectual history of Luo speakers. Her thesis, or dissertation rather, is an endeavor to examine how various actors in the 20th century Nyanza, vernacular historiographers, missionaries, school teachers, migrants, workers, academics, novelists, mobilized various varied narratives about the pre-colonial past of the Luo to advance contrasted and changing political, cultural, and social agendas. For our work, she has been able to present a part of it in the US, in San Diego, and in Chicago, as well as in France, and she has won some award on the same. Her presentation today will focus on the relationship between the development of mission education and vernacular writing in the Nyanza region. So her title for today is this: What counts as history, quote unquote, mission education, vernacular historiography, quote unquote, unmuted narratives in the 20th century Nyanza. So I once again want to welcome the audience and our colleagues online for this presentation today. And at this juncture, I have the honor of welcoming Esther Ginestet to the podium to take us through her presentation. Esther, you have about 1 hour, but if you finish early enough, we'll continue with the discussion. Welcome.
Is it on? All right, okay. All right, thank you, everyone. Good afternoon. Before I get to the heart of my presentation, I just want to say a couple of words. This is an interesting homecoming for me. I took my very first African history class in this department some 10 years back when I was an undergraduate student and I was doing some exchange program here at the University of Nairobi. I felt really welcomed at the time, and I still feel welcomed today. So I just want to say thank you very much. Thank you for allowing me to work here with you and for providing a platform to share my research. I would also like to thank the audience, both online and in presence, for giving me your time and giving me your attention, because I'm fully aware that everyone is quite busy this time of the year. So thank you so much. The paper that I am presenting today is part of my PhD dissertation. This research was initiated at Northwestern University, which is in the vicinity of Chicago, and also at Sciences Po University, because I'm a PhD candidate at both institutions. I began archival research here in Kenya in the month of April this year, and I'm planning to be around for quite some time, and I'm hoping to graduate by 2024. So my reason for boring you with all these technicalities is to explain in so many words that while this research has been going on for quite some time now, there's still room for me to make alterations. And so this is why when I come here today to share my research, I really want to say that I'm going to welcome your comments. and your feedback and your suggestions with an open heart and hopefully even an open mind towards the second half of this presentation. All right, so let's get into it. Today, I want to take us back in time to colonial Nyanza. In the context of colonial Nyanza, I am going to discuss, on the one hand, the development of mission education and mission literacy, with a focus on Luo intellectuals, Luo-speaking intellectuals. And I'm going to try to show the connection between mission education and mission literacy with the rise of vernacular writing, and particularly history writing published by Luo intellectuals in the Luo language. Now, the most critically minded among us might wonder why. They might wonder what the point of discussing vernacular colonial era, vernacular literacy and historiography is. And so I want to just begin to answer that question, the sort of so what question, with a story, because I'm a historian and that's what we do. And this is the story of how I came to this research topic. When I began my graduate studies at Northwestern University, I was initially interested in Luo migrants who had been working and living in Kampala up to 1970, when they were expelled by the Obote government. That expulsion is not very well known. It is not very well documented, much less so than the Asian expulsion that occurred a bit later. And so that's what I was interested in the beginning. And at that time, I was really struggling to find written sources to document that event. There was probably a reason why information was difficult to find and why historiography on the topic didn't exist. And I also had begun to take some Luo language classes. And so I was getting a bit annoyed and desperate, and I just decided to go to Northwestern Library, which is a library, as some of you may know, that is arguably one of the most extensive libraries on African related documents that there is in the world. So I went to the library and I decided to just retrieve all the material that I could find that was written in the Luo language. And that's what I did. And I found books, I found pamphlets, I found some vernacular newspapers, not so many. And this led me to various vernacular history books in particular. One of them was entitled The Udimak Central Nyanza. It was written during the colonial era, and it was documenting the history of the clans and genealogies of clans of Central Nyanza. It was written by a man who was called Shadrach Malo, who was a school teacher at Maseno, and who was also an assessor at the African Appeals Court. So he worked in the colonial state, in fact. And in a preface of this book, Malo described how he had conducted his research. He described how he had met with several elders from all the clans that he was documenting. He actually listed all those elders that he had spoken to, and he explained how he had collected all the oral traditions from these various people and why he had decided to compile all of them and publish his findings. And that's the reason he gave. According to him, the Luo youth, that is the people he was teaching in the school, because he was also a teacher. So this Luo youth of his day knew more about the history of Europeans and foreigners than they did about their own. And this really bothered Malo. This, he believed, was a sign of a kind of decay, and it presented a moral challenge, a moral and intellectual challenge that people like him, people who were literate, people who were spearheading, were kind of like an intellectual elite, had the duty to take up. And this was the challenge of taking traditional cultures, items of tradition, and adapting them to some modern mediums such as print, so that they don't get lost and so that the youth gets to know about them and pass the knowledge on. So as I went through more of these vernacular books, and there are several of them, I realized that Malo was not alone at all, that his thought was not, perhaps not as original as I had thought initially, that he was not alone in having such fears about the loss of custom and about the loss of intellectual traditions. Instead, he appeared to be one member of a much larger group of literati who from the interwar years onward were beginning to codify, to compile, to collect, to document indigenous customs and histories which had prevailed in the pre-colonial era. And so I began asking myself the following question. I began wondering what was at stake in these documents. I began wondering, what is it exactly that men like Malo were doing? What was at stake with writing ancient knowledge, older intellectual traditions, which had hitherto been passed on orally? What was happening in there? And I wondered how this process of knowledge making or knowledge repackaging, a process which was driven by men like Malo, by people who were mission educated people, like people who were a part of colonial society. So how this process was connected with colonialism, with some of the aspects of colonial society. What did it tell us about the colonial moment? What can it tell us also about oral traditions, about intellectual traditions that had existed before? Do these books tell us more about Malo, people like Malo, about school teachers? Do they tell us more about what Malo was aiming to actually do, which is documenting the pre-colonial past? What can we do with those? And so progressively, my project, my overall PhD project, morphed into something bigger, something a bit larger. And I want to just take some time to depict that larger framework so that everyone understands what the presentation today is trying to accomplish in that broader research project. So my PhD research examines the role that historical imaginations, the ways in which we imagine the past, the role that historical imaginations played in various areas of Luo social, political, and cultural life from the second half of the 19th century up to the 1970s, 1980s. The end date is still shifting a bit depending on the kinds of sources that I can find. And so in my work, I treat historical imagination, what I call historical imagination, and the contemporary uses of narratives about the deep past as a window. I treat it as a window onto larger social, cultural, and political transformations that affected Nyanza, but also East Africa more broadly. And so my dissertation traces how various Luo-speaking actors, I'm going to name just some of them. So we have mission-educated literati, but we also have grandmothers. We have urban migrants. And for the more contemporary period, we have Legio Maria followers, for example. So how these different kinds of Luo-speaking actors in very contrasted contexts have mobilized narratives about the past and different narratives about the past and about the Luo past, and how these actors did so while pursuing their own goals which were not so much set in the pre-colonial past, but very much belonged in the contemporary era. And so to do that, I rely on quite a heterogeneous set of primary sources. These include compilations of oral traditions that have been published, vernacular historiography, so books like Malo's book, some missionary archives, anthropological archives as well, some vernacular newspapers, and some novels as well, particularly novels by Grace Ogot and Asenath Boleodaga. So in my dissertation, I tried to make three interventions. My first intervention addresses the global history of history itself. as in history as a discipline, what we are all doing here. Historians of Europe, historians of Africa, but also of Southeast Asia have observed that the 19th and early 20th centuries correspond to a moment in which history is being standardized as a discipline. It is becoming a discipline. Historical knowledge, historical practices, writing, the ways that we check evidence, footnotes, all these things are sort of coming together as core elements that characterize what we academic historians do. And this moment of standardization of history writing practices, of the sort of social science of history, is really the moment in which we are canonizing history as being a science which is concerned with causality, chronology, and truth, as opposed to just storytelling in general, as opposed to telling legends. What history would be about is about explaining how things came to be, that's causality, how they changed over time, that's the chronology or diachrony aspect. And there's an expectation that what you're saying is true, that it's real. And this is not what other types of stories like legends, like folk tales do. And the same period, of course, is a period of colonial expansion. Throughout the colonial world, we see people like Malo, who are colonial subjects or colonized intellectuals who are involved in imperial structures, in imperial institutions like schools and churches. And a lot of these intellectuals turn to their own traditional knowledges or local knowledges that existed in their communities and begin to ask themselves how to submit them to historical inquiry. And so what they're looking to do in a lot of cases is to find how to bend intellectual traditions that they find so that they fit within what is being defined as history at the same time, knowing that that history is being defined mostly in Europe and North America. And so building on this scholarship, my research uses Nyanza, or Luo-speaking intellectuals, as a case study to interrogate what was at stake in that particular process of bending intellectual traditions that were there. I investigate how various Luo-speaking intellectuals engaged with, transformed more ancient knowledge-making practices that they found existing, and how they mobilize historical imagination doing that. I try to analyze the degree to which colonialism marks not only a moment of rupture, of cognitive rupture and of reinvention of tradition, but also a moment in which intellectuals engage seriously with older, pre-existing notions about historicity, about the past, and about storytelling. And when they engaged, they drew from things that were there, but they also transformed them. So I seek to shed light on a kind of intellectual history, a kind of East African intellectual history that describes change over time in the longue durée. For a period of a little over 100 years that spans from the late pre-colonial period, embraces the colonial period itself, and ends in the early post-colonial era. One of the payoffs of having such a big span, I think, is that this approach opens doors to ask new questions for historians, and particularly historians of East Africa and the East African Great Lakes. If we argue that the idea of there being such a thing as Luo history, for example, was the result of a contested process that unfolded during the colonial period and in response to colonial dynamics, then this suggests that other ways of conceiving the past, other ways of thinking of history, were maybe sidelined, showing how this process, the process of curating a past, happened, therefore, I hope, opens fresh perspectives to conceive history not only in Nyanza and not only for the Luo, but to conceive history in the East African Great Lakes along lines that are different than those that we have today. And I'm particularly thinking, and I will explain why over the course of the presentation, I think this opens doors to think about the pre-colonial past and about the colonial past as well, beyond ethnic descent, beyond ethnicity, beyond lineal descent. All right, so the section of my research that I really want to sort of dig into today explores how the first generation of mission-educated literati in Nyanza created a written corpus of historical texts about the Luo pre-colonial past. And I'm going to argue that vernacular history writing developed in the context which was marked heavily by colonial domination, by missionary Christianity, by land disputes, and by new patterns of migrancy and human mobility. And I'm going to try to show that these dynamics led to a rereading of the pre-colonial past through what was an increasingly ethnic lens, a lens that emphasized descent, that emphasized lineage, and that did so to the detriment of other ways of thinking about the past. All right, let me just get some water. Okay, so when European missionaries and the Luo intellectuals that they had trained began sifting through oral traditions around the 1900s and more so from the 1910s onwards, one of the first things that they did was to try to demarcate narratives that qualified as history proper and other stories that should instead be seen maybe as legendary, folkloric, and things like that. And the categories that I just mentioned, like legends, folklores, history, would probably have made little sense to people who lived 20 years before that, towards the late 19th century, before the full development of mission education. So here I'm drawing from the works of Atieno Odhiambo, David Cohen, Senato Daga, and Bethuelo Got. We know from their work that narratives concerned specifically about the past used to be conveyed in a Luo-speaking setting as part of Sigana. That is Luo oral literature, storytelling, narratives. In Luo homesteads, Sigana was passed on in various spaces, but the main social space where it was being taught was a house called Siwinde. In Siwinde, an old woman, a woman who was past child rearing years, and that woman was called Pim. So that old woman would pass on all kinds of knowledges to young boys and girls using stories to intellectuals like Pim, because I would like to say that these old women were intellectuals in their own right. To intellectuals like Pim, categories like legends, folklore, or history probably didn't matter so much. Because what made a story good, and it's something that we should think about as historians a bit more often, maybe, at least I think I should think about it more often. What makes a story good is it's not really its degree of truth. It's not its degree of invention. And it's not its ability to draw chronology, causality. What makes a story worth telling is its capacity to convey useful meaning in the present to an audience. And that was the kind of pedagogy that storytellers like Pim were engaged in, conveying meaning. Conveying meaning, meaningful things, doesn't really mean that the stories we have to tell have to be true. You can convey meaningful lessons by saying things that never happened, or by twisting a story that happened in a way that suits your present needs. But missionaries treated stories quite differently. So I worked on various textbooks, missionary textbooks that I have found in various libraries here in Nairobi and also in the US. And one of them is an Adventist textbook, which was published in 1930 in Kendu Bay, and that I found at the Anglican Center Library on Bishop Road here in Nairobi. So this textbook, it was authored by European missionaries for use in African schools, and it is useful to see what kinds of uses missionaries had for storytelling as part of the curriculum that they were trying to teach. In this book, the European authors weave together various fables of like classic European folklore or fables, and they weave them together with biblical stories. We have the story of Job and so many others. And they put next to those narratives about the history of evangelization elsewhere on the African continent. I think this textbook suggests that storytelling was used in mission schools as a means to make African children familiar with mainly European missionary values, worldviews, and history, with a European intellectual heritage. At least that's what that particular textbook suggests. But I discovered that some other missionaries went way further and really sought to interrogate how to incorporate Luo stories into that curriculum. What was their place? And one of those missionaries was an Anglican missionary who was working at Maseno and later went to Mia, and who was called Meya. Meya published in 1938 a book dedicated to Luo heroes with 18 chapters, each of which dealt with a particular character. So we have like some of the classic figures, like there's a chapter on Gor Mahia, which is chapter 1. Then we have a chapter on Luandag Magere and a chapter on others. So each of these chapters are biographies that try to draw some kind of moral story, depict some characters, and have some broader implications, set some broader implications for what that life of that person told us. Meya signaled in the preface of this book that he was really anxious to establish some partition between what appeared to him, that is a British Anglican teacher, as really historical, and what was just legendary. And he wrote, I quote, "There are things in this book which Christians may not agree with." And then he goes on, "Every country in the world has stories like these, which people may believe are true, but which are not." And he says, "It is the teacher's duty to indicate to his students while teaching which aspects are true and which are not." So here, one of the things that we see at play is a reinterpretation of Luo stories that Meya and his students found were there, because Meya was sending his students to their home villages to collect those stories and bring them back to the school to compile them. But those stories are being reevaluated against standards that did not initially apply to them. And those standards had something to do with truth-telling. One of the stakes now for missionaries was to really indicate what counted as history and what didn't. But Westerners, I've cited Western authors so far, but Westerners did not really dominate the vernacular publishing industry at all. In Nyanza, it is Luo school teachers who were themselves mission-educated literati who did. And to understand why, I need to tell you an adjacent story about the sociology of African school teachers in the Winam Gulf and their changing role in colonial education and society from the 1900s to the 1940s. So one of the really original aspects of the development of mission education in the Winam Gulf region, and sometimes a bit up north as well, is the central role that a very diverse crowd of East African school teachers in Maseno, in Nia, in Kendube, sometimes also in Butere, played in developing mission education. And it's an originality because of the timing of missionary developments and mission expansion in that region. I'm going to explain why. The role of African school teachers can be, I want to point out here that I have a source issue. The role of African school teachers can be difficult to document, especially of the first generations. And it can be difficult to document if we use only missionary records, like those that you would find in the CMS, Church Missionary Society records at the Kenya National Archives, for example. But it comes out a bit more clearly when we look at other types of sources, and I'm going to explain to you what sources I've used. In the mid-1960s, a group of students at Limuru Theological College set out to conduct a series of oral interviews with the first generations of converts who lived in Nyanza and Western Kenya, more broadly conceived. These interviews are still there. They're in Limuru, the interview transcripts. So it is possible today to go to Limuru Library and see what material was collected orally in the 1960s from people who are telling about events that happened in the 1900s and that they have lived through. So using those interviews, we can learn really quite a great variety of things. We learn a lot about politics in the 1920s and the involvement of African school teachers in political organizations. We learn a lot about the relationship between white and African school teachers in the schools. But we also learn about other things, such as the identity and the origins of the very first generations of African school teachers who operated in those schools. And so I used those interviews in that way. One of the things that came out really clearly is that using those transcripts is that although European missionaries were quite powerful, they were also very limited in a number of ways. And those include cultural and linguistic matters. European missionaries took a long time to learn the languages of the people that they wanted to teach. It took them time. It was a painful process. They weren't particularly good at it. And obviously you have to add the race factor to it. They were white. And so they had all these different kinds of issues, and they also caused a number of cultural clashes. So all these issues were a real break for, they were slowing down what was the goal of European missionaries, which was evangelization. And so to solve that, European missionaries in the Winam Gulf region, in Maseno, in Nia, in Kendube, they very often decided to rely on African school teachers that they recruited from elsewhere and brought to these mission schools. And we have two categories of school teachers that really stand out. Number one, we have a lot of Ganda teachers who came from neighboring Buganda. And number two, we have a lot of evangelists who came from Mozambique and who were specifically from the Yao group. I'm just going to say a bit more about the Yao case because I think it's really quite interesting. So the people who are called Yao in those transcripts are people who were often enslaved at an early point in their life, would then find themselves in circumstances that would allow them to be set free. And they would then join places like Fairtown on the Indian Ocean coast. And in Fairtown, they'd be trained to become evangelists themselves. And those people would then be sent to other areas in Kenya along the coast, but not just along the coast. And there were many in the schools that I've cited to spread the gospel. And they were very reliable as far as European missionaries were concerned, because European missionaries saw them as indebted for their freedom to them. So, and in Buganda, the case is a bit different because we don't have the narrative of slavery coming into play, but evangelization in Buganda, just as along the Indian Ocean coast, gets an earlier start than it does in the Winam Gulf. And because of that, it means that by 1906, for example, which is when Maseno is open, you don't have any Luo-speaking teacher available to teach. But you do have a lot of Ganda literati who are already doing that job not very far away from here. And so it is quite easy for the Church Missionary Society, for example, to bring those people in and tell them, all right, you're going to help us set up this school and start evangelization here. And so we see that in the 1900s, we have a very diverse crowd of East African school teachers who are doing a lot of the teaching, doing a lot of the writing dictionaries in local languages, doing a lot of research, cultural research on the people that they're trying to teach, who are already operating here. But over time, mission schools tend to lose a bit of this East African orientation and become more centered on the particular ethno-linguistic groups that they are catering to. So typically people who were students in the 1900s or 1910s at Maseno would then graduate and become teachers by the 1920s. And that means that you now have a local recruitment of teachers rather than needing to import people from far away. So this shift is mainly explained by, as they said, the rise of a homegrown generation of literati. And among these literati, we find quite a lot of people who are going to become quite active in political activism and who founded organizations like Pinyowacho. We found a lot of critiques, early critiques of the colonial state, people who voiced concerns over the, and did more than voicing concerns, that's a euphemism, people who fought against the transition of Kenya to a colony, to the colony status, people who fought colonial taxation, people who became really quite active in advocating for Africans' land rights against European settlers. So among this group of homegrown literati who are rising in the early 1920s, we have people who are going to become leaders and very, very, very vocal advocates. But among them, we also find the Luo's first historians and authors who aimed to preserve the language, the culture, and claimed to be doing something like fighting for the conquest of an indigenous, of an African intellectual dignity that would be just as valid as European intellectual traditions. And they did so using some of the tools of the oppressor because they did so using writing and printing, which came with the missions. So they would print, the first books that we find about Luo history are printed at Maseno with the printing press that was there. And I want to elaborate a bit on three specific cases of Luo vernacular authors and school teachers who wrote about the Luo past. For each case, I'm going to try to show how their position in colonial society shaped their vision of what counted as a valid past, as a past worth telling. And they're quite different, you're going to see, and they also belong to different contexts, both in time, but also in terms of the social spaces that they care about and that they are really invested in. And I want to begin with a very classic one, and this is Paul Mboya. Mboya was from South Nyanza. He was the author of a famous, very famous publication, which is Kitgi. It's the Luo beliefs and customs. It was first published in 1938, and his book really became some kind of cultural Bible at some point. I hope the expression is not offensive to anybody. What I mean is that it became a point of reference that everyone would read, everyone would know, everyone would cite. It became a standard, very standard reading, with many renditions to this day, both in Luo, but also in English. There's various translations of this book. The main one is done by Jaina Chieng, who actually worked here at the University of Nairobi. But he was also the author of two much lesser known works. One of them is Richo e Makelo Chia, which is concerned with how digression from certain forms of traditional behavior can bring about bad things. This is not the right word. Can bring about bad events and some bad consequences. And another one of his books was Wadi Coronation, which is the story of how he goes to England to see the coronation of the Queen. But these two works are much lesser known than the first one I cited. Mboya was also an Adventist pastor, and this matters to understand how he made sense of his own work and his own writing. In the introduction of Kitgi Timbegi, Mboya claims that it was God's design to gift every community with its own customs, its own belief systems, and its own ways of doing things. And that adopting the customs of foreigners blindly while forgetting your own is therefore a deviation from God's designs. And clearly here we have a not so veiled critique of what is going on in mission schools, for example. And his work, therefore, he saw his own work as an attempt to reconstruct, to give people to see every aspect of Luo traditional life. So in his book, he mentions, his book is kind of like an encyclopedia. He tells about a lot of different topics. It's about leadership, it's about foodways, it's about raising children, it's about storytelling, and then so many other things. And what he wanted to do was to tell how all these aspects of Luo life, social life in the past, before the coming of the whites, how all these things were, not really just as a way of defying European ways or mission expansion, but also as a way of restoring something like a moral collective order, which he believed was going astray. And so that collective order, he claimed, was an order wanted by God and an order that had to be enacted by men like himself and by the Luo collectivity more broadly. Though he was a man who came from a very specific place, Mboya he came from Carachonyo. He did not seek to speak really only about his home or just about his clan. Instead, he tried to write a book that depicted Luo ways in a way that was homogenizing them a bit, making them look like this was the typical thing that every single Luo homestead would do. And he even integrated some stories that likely have Bantu origins and relabeled them as Luo stories. And this was the Luo way and the Luo story. And so in that way, what Mboya is doing, I suspect, is that he's beginning to produce an ethno-national narrative. A narrative that's not just about his home, that's not just about his clan. He's providing some ideas about how things were for the Luo in general in the past. And by printing them in Luo and aiming to broadcast them throughout Luo land, he's trying to produce something like ethno-national belonging. So that was the first historian, though maybe he was not just a historian, that I wanted to talk about. The second one is Shadrach Malo. Shadrach Malo published his work 15 years after Mboya. So we have a big gap here. But he began researching his book 10 years before publication. So actually he probably began researching those, let's say, 5 years after the publication of Mboya's book. So Shadrach Malo's book is about the history of the clans of central Nyanza. And it adopts a really different approach from Mboya's. And that contrast is interesting to stop and think about. He gives us a glimpse into, I'm going to argue that this difference gives us a glimpse into a completely different scene of colonial society and at a different time. So Shadrach Malo, like Mboya, belongs to the first 2 generations of literati who are educated in mission schools. Malo was a teacher. He worked at Maseno, which is also the place where he had been a student before. And he, like Mboya, he wrote various other books that were not just about history, including, for example, he wrote a textbook about the Luo language for Luo learners. And he also wrote some kind of encyclopedia on Luo customs that got published much, much, much later on after his death, but that he had begun writing from the 1960s, I think. So it's some work that was published in the 1990s, but that has a longer time span than just the 1990s. Malo was a passionate user and analyst of the Luo language. That one was clear. He didn't just write a textbook on how to learn it, but he also worked for many, many years in an organization which was called the Luo Language Committee. This was an organization which was started under the umbrella of the Church Missionary Society, and that aimed to oversee and standardize the Luo language, Luo writing, and Luo orthography, and to promote the publication of books, both religious, but also non-religious, in the vernacular. Documenting the activities of that particular committee, I was finding it a bit challenging, but I was lucky enough to stumble upon a file which documents those quite precisely with their correspondence and some of their proceedings at the Anglican Church archives on Bishop Road as well. So that was a lucky find for me, and I was quite happy with it. And you can see when you go through those documents that people like Malo progressively really take over the organization and are kind of running the show, and that the first European missionaries who had started it, people like Meyer, that I cited a bit earlier in my talk, are kind of being pushed to the background towards the 1940s and 50s and giving way to people like Malo, who were homegrown and who really cared about vernacular publishing and vernacular writing. But most importantly, even more important than all the language stuff, Malo worked in the colonial justice system. He notably worked as an assessor at the Africans Appeal Court, and he would later become the president of the same court when that office was opened to Africans. Research into the archives of African tribunals and the African Appeals Court in Nyanza, here at the Kenya National Archives, has shown me that by the late 1920s and the 1930s, when Malo is beginning his work at the court, the overwhelming majority of the cases that men like Malo are hearing are land disputes. And this is very relevant. I'm going to say why. When we look at those land disputes, especially at the appeals court, which is trying to decide whether an earlier judgment was, an earlier sentence was justified or not, both parties come and have to explain in great detail how the land that they're quarreling over has been occupied, how it has been used, who came first, under what status was that person in that land. How did the use of that land change over time? Who was actually farming this land? And giving all that information is basically giving a genealogy of land occupation. What you have to do that, to make your case, is to give a story about change over time, a story about when it began, how it changed, and how it is today. And why, therefore, this land should be mine, or this land should be the other person's. And so, judicial arguments, the judicial arguments that Malo had to hear, and that he had to provide advice on how to rule them, were basically historical arguments. He was doing history as part of his job. It was all about those genealogies of land occupation, and it was also about truthfulness, because truth in tribunals matters. Truth and credibility, it is about evaluating which argument is the most credible, which one is the most likely, how we think it went down. So it is not that surprising to find that people like Malo, on their free time, when they weren't teaching or when they weren't doing their work in the appeals court, were writing history books. We can see that there's a kind of kinship between the work that he was doing and the kind of writing that he did during his spare time. But unlike Mboya, Malo's book did not really seek to provide a broad picture of Luo ways. It wasn't about that at all. Instead, his book provided a specific picture of lineaged histories set in a particular region, central Nyanza, which naturally also happened to be the region where he was working as an assessor. And so, a forefather of Luo clan history, Malo's work is therefore inseparable from the inner workings of the colonial state and of the justice system, and probably of land as it was unfolding during the colonial era. The last example that I want to give before I conclude is the example of Samuel Ayan. Samuel Ayan was the author of Karchakrok Marluo. That's the beginning of the Luo, the origins of the Luo. Ayan authored this book around the same time as Malo, but he operated from a completely different vantage point. He was an alumni and he was a teacher. He had been a teacher at Maseno, like many of the other people that I've already mentioned, but he began working on Luo history while he was a student at Makerere in Uganda. At Makerere, Ayan discovered a few things. The first thing that he discovered is that he discovered the work of Ganda literati in Luganda. He began reading and admiring the fact that Ganda intellectuals had, according to him, really gotten a head start on writing their own histories and owning it. And so he was finding this quite inspirational. This he writes in the introduction of his book. And the second thing that he discovered at Makerere is that he became familiar with other Luos who were not Kenyan Luos. He began reading about Acholi history, about the Jopadola, about the Alur, and he began to develop a completely different kind of framework. So his work, unlike the work of Malo, which was really about central Nyanza and really about clan histories, is a much, much larger work with a, I'm going to call this a pan-nilotic view of history. And what he tried to do is to describe the migration of the Luo all the way from the Sudanese cradle through Uganda, and the kinship, to describe the kinship that existed between all the kinds of Luos and Nilotic speakers that spread along the way. So unlike Malo, Ayan's search for origins adopted a very large East African pan-Nilotic lens. But like Malo, his work was built on an important assumption, which is the assumption that history had something to do, or was easier to write, when someone associates it with some sense of genealogy, of descent, and some sense of space, of geography. So lineal descent, genealogy, some sense of geography, and lastly, some sense of truth-telling. All right, and I'm going to sort of wrap it up now. Together, historians, vernacular historians like Mboya, like Malo, and like Ayan invented a way of practicing Luo historiography. The Luo historiography that they invented sometimes, but not always, homogenized Luo ways and culture. But very often it reconstructed closely lineage histories and genealogies. And it emphasized descent from common ancestors, descent that binded people together in a way that has a kinship with ethnicity, with how we conceive of ethnicity. And they subscribed to ideas about truth and about a sense of chronology. Change over time mattered to them. Truth-telling also mattered. And so in this process, such intellectuals selected the narratives that they taught, selected the narratives that they told, and they probably also sidelined other narratives about the past that did not sit so easily with the standards of truth and of historicity that I just mentioned. If we read some of the early stories that were published in the vernacular, we find a lot of stories about rainmaking, about women and men traveling the lakes landscape, performing a variety of miracles or extraordinary actions. Those stories, we find them in books that are about stories, but we don't quite as easily find them in books like Malo's book that claim to be historical and not just about stories in general. And I think, and I'm going to finish to wrap it up with this, I think that there is value in asking ourselves what was lost, what was gained and what was lost when mission-educated intellectuals set out to curate a usable past that focused on genealogy, descent, and truth. There is value in asking whether other narratives about the past have survived elsewhere, outside of the printing world, outside of the world of books, or even within the world of books, but in different kinds of disciplines than history. And there is value in asking ourselves what the recovery of these narratives can teach us about the past that we don't already know, about the past of the Winam Gulf, but about the past of Luo speakers, but also maybe about the past of of the East African Great Lakes and of other communities that have interacted with the Luos as well. All right, and I'm going to stop here. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Esther, for the beautiful presentation that you have just given us. So you've heard what has been telling us for the last couple of minutes, quite interesting. And a number of highlights can be picked out from our presentation, from the journey that you walked from the Northwestern University all the way to Kampala, and then finding our way to Nairobi, and then getting the archival materials that at the end of the day led to what she's doing now at the PhD level, both at Northwestern University and the Sciences Po University. So in essence, what Esther has been telling us is about the interplay between mission education and basically what can be described as Luo history. And before I delve further, I want to acknowledge our dean, who I think came in a bit late, Professor Jack Odhiambo, who is online, our dean, Faculty of Art and Social Sciences. Oh, sorry. Okay, thank you, Professor. Welcome to this session. And for those who came in a bit late, you're also welcome to this session. So going forth, it's about what she has told us, that interplay between mission education and the early generation of those kind of scholars, and basically how they are able to put together what today we can describe as Luo history. And she has been able to walk us through that journey, including, of course, a bit of a methodology over time to what she's achieved thus far. But again, to focus on her specific presentation, she's been able to talk about some of the eminent personalities who have gotten this job done, so to speak. And a number of them come from the Christian world. And I think if I had that right, a number of people from the Seventh Adventist Church, the SDA, were able to put together a number of writings that to some degree also shaped, so to speak, what today we are learning from her. That is what really should count as history on the basis of the varied background of the many people participated in, if you want, patching together what today you can call Luo history. Of course, talk about the approaches from the different people in this endeavor, the missionaries themselves who are endeavoring to basically put some kind of connection between what they had from Europe and what they found in Africa. And I bet it was not an easy task. But again, she was able now to come to the first generation of the African mission-educated scholars who had this monumental task of knitting together what their people had had over the years. But again, they had to deal with fitting that within the scale of what was supposed to be history as learned over time from Europe. Remember, most of our work is about the colonial period, and of course, all the way to the early post-colonial period. So let's talk about the African school teachers and what they're able to do, and their documentation is quite fundamental in what she's doing now, particularly the group she talked about from Limuru, right? Of course, the challenges these guys had in putting that together. And then to the very end, she talked about the likes of Mboya again, and how this Mboya character, so to speak, was able to espouse the centrality or the need for people, so to speak, amongst the Luo to be alert and to kind of get to know their history, quote unquote, interface, I think, then of the advent of colonialism and, of course, Christianity that was sweeping, so to speak, through Luo area of territory back then. I think Mboya was like on another level, probably that's my own thinking, yeah, not what you said, that may maybe describe the bit of pride, sorry for that, hopefully I do not offend anyone, among the Luo, right? I don't know, guys, if you walk around town over the weekends and you take note of the Golmaya funds, there's a way of names on the backs of the t-shirts. Right, just something. I think there's a lot of pride amongst the Luo vis-a-vis maybe where some of us come from. We are a bit timid. Sorry for that, but there's that connection. But that's not for what for this presentation, good people. So and then talk about, of course, Shadrach at the tail end. And what she was able to put together, particularly on, of course, the lineage of the Central Nyanza clans. And I think I bet that also contributed to the eventual knitting together of Luo history that we read today, so to speak, from eminent scholars, the likes of Professor Gott, and of course, people of his generation, the likes of the late Professor Atieno Diambo, and even, of course, William Ucheng, amongst many, many more. So at the end of the day, it's like Esther has endeavored to bring to us that interplay, so to speak, between the different cadre of the people who were able to have a chance to write what they were getting from amongst the Luo people. And of course, they were dealing with that in a time when they also had some influences. Particularly from the missionaries at the time. And maybe then that should keep us, of course, thinking about what we read today as Luo history. To what degree was it probably authentic, very factual? To what degree was it shaped by the missionaries? To what degree was it shaped by the experiences of these first generation mission-educated intellectuals from amongst the Luo community? So at that juncture, then, good people, I want to open this up for discussion. I think we'll start from the audience here. So I'll allow initially 4 questions or comments on what she has told us this afternoon. So Dr. Gashi will start us off, and then I'll go to the Dean, and then I'll come up front here to Professor, and then finally, the 4th person will be our chair, Dr. Ken Ombongi. Okay, Dr. Gashi. Esther, you can take note of what they'll be saying.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Esther, for that very interesting discussion that you have set upon us this afternoon. I have a few comments and maybe a couple of questions. Because I find the debate very scintillating, so to speak, for those of us who are interested in missions, education, and vernacular historiographies. And actually, your title brings to mind immediately the Historian's Handbook by Carr, What is History? At what point do mere facts about the past transform to becoming historical facts? Now, I am persuaded that the vernacular historiography that you are speaking about also speaks to the dialectics between tradition and modernity. You could correct me if I'm wrong. And my question is, my first question, were the structures that shaped political, social debate in Nyanza, were they local or territorial? That's my first question. The second one, Lonsdale talks a lot about the same sort of drift of your discussion when he looks at, for example, the early vernacular journals in Kikuyu land, you know, Mwigwithania, Mumenyereri, and the others, and which have now become documentary sources that you also speak about. And these journals were a product of Kikuyu political thought. Okay? So I'm wondering, listening to you, to what extent did the vernacular historiography you're talking about reflect the provenance or the origin, if you want, and how far did they mimic a Western public doctrine? And finally, and I think very importantly, is the question of sources. As Ogot tells us in 1981, that history is a discipline of contexts, that we can only make critical judgment when we immerse ourselves in the easy familiarity with the immediate political context. And I ask because for someone who is non-Luo like myself and yourself, how do we rethink ethnic pasts without losing, so to speak, the discursive and moral environments that have birthed and nurtured those pasts? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I've been quite impressed by what you've told us about the Luo history. I'm not a historian, I'm a philosopher, but I come from that area. My question relates a little bit with what Dr. Agashihi has asked. I think the issue of lethargy in laziness in recording historical facts. So my question is, how will you be sure that you get correct facts, or that facts are actually transmitted? Because you'd find that people who are used to a certain event will not value it so much as to record it. I remember my grandfather was telling me about Gor Mahia. I think you mentioned some of these people. And he talked about how the European governor or ruler that in Kisumu arrested Gor Mahia. I think it was somebody called Obl or Obilo, I'm not sure. And this magician turned himself into a ball of something. And in this way, he was able to escape. That story impressed me. So I'm wondering, how are you able to get historical facts when time has passed? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Juang is my name. I woke up from my sleep because I've not been feeling well. I've been resting. In fact, I'm no longer teaching. But I decided to pull myself from my bed to this lecture room because of Esther, whom I met in the year 2012. She was a history and archaeology student. And then I saw a strange face in my class, BA anthropology class, and I was taking them in historical and comparative linguistics. And she requested me to attend my historical and comparative linguistics. I was at that time using the Swadesh list, where you use about 207 words and you compare them with the related languages, cognate languages. So that's historical linguistics, not history. And it was part of anthropology. She disappeared from my vicinity for several years, and she used to write to me emails. And then I referred her to some contacts in Western Kenya and in Uganda, and she has resurfaced recently doing her PhD and teaching me Luo, which is very surprising. Now, this is what I admire with some scholars, Western scholars who come here, they're so devoted, they do the recording. And Professor Udhiambo from Nyakach Plateau, talking about laziness. Well, we have a lot of lazy African historians and scholars. But some of these Wazungu scholars like Esther are very resilient because she's actually working with me on some translations. Richo Emakelochira from Paul Mboya. 1, 2, I'm making very, very personal comments. 2, Paul Mboya was my uncle on my mother's side. So it's my maternal, it was my maternal, or he is because he's alive in spirit. He's my maternal uncle. And I'm in touch with his youngest son, Duncan, who is a journalist. And the family have contracted a writer at Oxford, I think a Kalenjin guy, who is working with some Wazungus, and the grandson is a medical doctor, and they're writing a full researched biography of Paulo Mboya. It's going to be launched this year. I think it's the elections which stopped them from launching it because they didn't want campaigns to drown the launching of the biography of Paul Mboya, my maternal uncle. So if you cut my skin, the blood which will come out is blue in color, not red, because it was royal and my mother was royal. So I'm happy to announce to my brother here and my brother, the dean, and my sister, my classmate, the historian, that Paul Mboya's full, well-documented research is coming out, and somebody from Oxford is working on it, which is very exciting. Mboya didn't have much of education, but he listened to elders, he talked to elders, and then he knew how to read and write. And then he jotted down whatever he had. But now we are going to have a full biography. 3, my sister talked about Kikuyu, were they magazines or newspapers, but they were in the Kikuyu language. And I think Jomo Kenyatta was one of them, one of the journalists. Let me call him a vernacular journalist. Jomo Kenyatta was a vernacular journalist, and they used to write about their experiences in their language. And some of those printed material are available in some archives. But I'm discovering that our archives are very dilapidated and specialized archives are not accessible. Again, I thank Esther. She availed to me archival material about the Luo people done by Wazungus way back in 1929, the year my mother was born. And she retrieved them from CMS. Those of you who know CMS archives at the Anglican Church of Kenya. And are our students aware of that private archive owned by a Christian denomination, Anglican Church? And I also visited Rongai yesterday. Someone managed to take me there. And Rongai has a small university run by Seventh-day Adventists, Ubongi's church. They are on top of the hill. And then they took me to an archival facility known as Ellen G. White Estate. Ellen G. White Estate. Now, those of you who are Adventists or who know about Adventists in Southern Nyanza probably know about Ellen G. White and what they call Voice of Prophecy and her writings. She had over 5,000 articles, some of them compiled into books, and the books number about 50 in all. So that again is a private archive. So I am addressing the historian. The historian, the archivally based historian, because my background is linguistics, education, and more recently anthropology. I love oral literature because I am the lazy type. But for you, the rigorous type who goes to the archive, like Atieno Diambo. Atieno Diambo used to tell me, and most of you, all the elderly guys, know Atieno Diambo. Atieno Diambo was my personal friend. He used to tell me, he was much older though, that he was an archival historian. He told me there's a difference between an archival historian and a non-archival historian, an oral historian. So he used to tell me personally that he was slightly different from his teacher, Bethuel Arana Ogot, who largely in 1967 relied on the oral tradition, the spoken word. So the modern historian, what are you to benefit from what is available from the archives? And with the digital technology, can we improve our methodologies? That's point number 3. Lastly, and briefly, I want to thank Esther and congratulate Esther upon her presentation. I think that she has been resilient. She is not lazy. She works very hard. And I think this PhD is going to be an earth-breaking PhD. And let us continue to support her morally, spiritually, culturally, intellectually. And I have given her a Luo name. These days I call her Esther Adiambo. So let Adiambo continue with her good work. Thank you very much. Yeah.
I think I should stand since I'm in front here. Esther, I will use your new name, Adiambo. Thank you, Professor Diambo, for being with us this afternoon, our Dean. This is where your subjects are every Thursday between 2:30 and 4:30 from history and archaeology. And thank you for being with us today. Dr. Juang, thank you for coming. The hill you are referring to is called the Advent Hill in Rongai, where the Adventist University of Africa is, and also the headquarters of the Seventh-day Adventist Church in Eastern and Central Africa. That's where they are. They are very interesting things, I think even more than the archives that you saw the other day. The historian you are referring to is Geoffrey Sang, who is going to be one of the presenters in this seminar series, talking about some things in Kalenjin biblical translations. I know that he is working with some team from Oxford, trying to reconstruct the history of Paul Mboya, who was an Adventist pastor and later on a paramount chief. And now I learned that he is your uncle. And remember, Okoto Kombo told us that a dead African is not dead. So Mboya is probably hovering around and seeing his son saying stuff. Thank you. Now, Adhiambo, 3 quick, small questions. But first, I will say I will invoke my Luo descent. This is what Ochuang doesn't know, and say Rokamano. You have done well. One is, you're talking about vernacular histories. And as you spoke, an idea came to my mind that English language was actually, and I think still is, a very hegemonic language in our villages, very dominant. Of course, very strongly enforced by our teachers, some of them who had very strong colonial roots. I remember my primary school head teacher in the 80s, who was an Englishman in all senses of that word, except the skin color. In those village settings, and I guess the tradition continues, we were forced, literally, to speak English in schools. And our local languages were criminalized. I don't know whether some of you remember that, that we were made to hate our local languages. And then you would be made to feel embarrassed for speaking in your mother tongue. And then they will hang something on your neck. I don't know whether some of you remember those things they used to call the disc, simply because you spoke your mother tongue. In a sense then, English has over time evolved to be a mark of civilization. I know that in my village, cats who never went to school, when they have had one too many, they speak some English as they walk home. Otherwise, anyway, when I go to my local church and read my Bible in Ekeusi, which is my language, many people doubt whether I have gone to school, because for them, getting your language and becoming very proficient in English. Now, given this, and this is where my question is, how did Luo vernacular historiography manage to survive in an environment that seems to me was kind of forcefully dominated by English? Some of the writers you have quoted were some of the very first Christian converts who constituted a very strong spiritual wing of imperialism, as it were. What made vernacular histories survive this onslaught from English? That's one. Number two, very quickly, B.O. Gott, in his autobiography, gives us a binary of two villages, which are an embodiment of his life. One village, of course, is Christian, worshipped God, and were not involved in sinful things and acts like polygamy and many others. So they were heaven-bound, in a sense, to use some words from some English hymn, they were pressing on the upward way. Now, there was this other village, the non-Christian, more liberal, and they enjoyed the abundance of African cultures in all its facets. And the two were in constant, contention, if I have understood Professor Gott right. Now, and this is where vernacular historiographies represent, the non-Christian village, which seemed to contradict the Christian village, which I guess probably where English could have been quote unquote holier than the Luo, And if it did that, now this is related to what I asked her earlier. What enabled these vernacular historiographies to thrive? And the last one, a small one, I want to believe that you have read Antonio Gramsci, The Prison Notes. He talks about socio-hegemony that is driven by dominant social narratives. Now, is there a way vernacular historiographies could easily be regarded to constitute some kind of social hegemony that could probably, in a sense, determine the power hierarchies that operated in those fairly localized settings? Thank you, Adhiambo.
Questions, and of course, to respond to your friend, Dr. Ojuang. Okay, take the podium, please.
Okay. Yeah, right. Thank you, everyone, for the very generous questions and comments that I got. Thank you so much. All right, let's dig into it. So I loved all the questions I got. I have to say, I really mean it when I say thank you. What is history? How do facts become historical facts? How does the opposition between tradition and modernity play into those processes? Like you said, facts become historical facts. Nothing that happens is a historical fact in and of itself. Me speaking to you is not a historical fact until someone writes that it happens and that was a fact. What makes it a fact is that someone builds it as such, as part of a broader narrative. I think that's absolutely essential in the story that I was trying to bring up today. And thank you for giving me the language to say it, because I think that's exactly what I was trying to say. So thank you. And how much of this process can we plot in terms of a tradition versus modernity thing? The vocabulary of tradition and modernity is a vocabulary that people at the time, people who were writing those books, thought was absolutely essential. It's the two villages to build on something that we were just told. It's the Christian one that was the sign of modernity versus the pagan one that would have been tradition. And that clash that resulted is the kind of clash that people doing vernacular historiography were trying to overcome or to reconcile and to dig into and to really wrestle with. But I don't know. So it's an essential category for the actors at the time. And it's a category that we have to interrogate. We have to understand what they meant when they said things that were done forever and ever, that have been done forever and ever. Or when they say that it's the things of today. When they speak about their vision of Christianity versus how things were before the coming of missionaries. So it's important that we understand what people mean when they use these kinds of categories, but I don't think that it is, I think it is a bit treacherous, or it's a bit dangerous for us as historians to use those in the writing to describe the things that were happening. And here's why. Here's why I think this. Because, in fact, what we're seeing is not a tradition versus modernity thing. It's the coming together of various kinds of traditions. Adventist Christianity is a kind of tradition. It has an intellectual tradition of its own, and it's not the same as Anglican not exactly the same as the Anglican tradition of Christianity. It's not exactly the same as the Catholic one. The English traditions are not exactly the same as French ones, for example. And so what we see, and even if we go a bit deeper into the history of the region, it's not a Luo versus missionaries. It's not just that that's going on. We have different Luo speaking groups, but we also have, for example, Suba actors who are coming into play with their own traditions as well. We have, as I said, as described in the presentation, we have Ganda teachers who are coming in with their own vision of things. So I think it's more useful to try to break down what the word tradition can mean, to explain what the actors at the time meant by it when they used it, and to try to distance ourselves a little bit from it. I don't mean not using it, because if people use it, it's because it has meaning and it has power, but to be as specific as we can when we use those words, because it's not just it wasn't just a binary between the West and local circumstances. It was a bit more complex than that. And that brings me to the second point about how much of this was local and territorial. And possibly what are the connections with Kikuyu actors? The connections were many. Like I said, I found archives, really important archives in Limuru and in other parts of the country that are not in Luo-speaking areas. And there's a reason for that. It's because a lot of the school teachers that I'm describing, and the first generation of homegrown school teachers, they didn't just sit there and spend their entire lives in the schools in which they taught or were students. Many of them traveled. Many of them were became students in Limuru in the 1950s. Many of them went to other places. They were very, very much aware of developments in central Kenya. It mattered. They talk about it in the interview transcripts that I read. So it's not really local in the sense of being in isolation with other things that would be going on elsewhere. There's a kind of, I'm sort of drawing from Derek Peterson, there's a kind of cosmopolitan orientation that these vernacular writers have. They're looking for maybe, yes, they're speaking from a place, and they're writing in the vernacular for reasons that are sometimes very local, but they're also very much aware of the East African context, the much broader East African context that they're engaged in. Some of them study at Makerere, etc., etc. So there's definitely like a story of connection that goes beyond just what's going on there. And I think that's another reason why that case study can speak to histories that are not just Luo histories. I think that there are connections between the actors and etc., etc. What is it like when I'm not a Luo to do this kind of work? I think it's an enormous challenge, because it requires an insane amount of work and of challenges that I have to overcome. And one of the ways in which I do that is I rely a lot on people like Professor Zhuang, who came today. It's problematic in many ways. But I try to come at it from a place of not thinking of the things that I'm describing as being, they're unique, but they're not strange. Like, historical imagination is essential to the way most nations in the world think of themselves. the processes of languages taking over vernaculars is not something that we find only here in Kenya. Vernacular historiography is also not something that we found only here. So I'm French. French is a hegemonic language like English. It's a hegemonic language abroad. It was also a hegemonic language at home. And in my own family, my grandfather is a vernacular author who wrote in the vernacular that was there before French that I don't speak. So so it's not really an answer, but it's my non-answer to your important question. All right, how do I know that I get the facts right? How do I know I get the facts right? A lot of the times, knowing that you get the facts right, you're not going to know it at first. You can't recognize that a story is true just by itself. One of the things that we do is that we cross-reference, and a lot of the times, maybe the facts we get are not right. And maybe that's not what matters. Because when people tell stories, they're again not just looking at truth, they're looking to convey meaning, and that's relevant historical information as well. For example, a story that a grandfather tells to his grandchildren in a particular setting is not meant to be told in another setting. It's meant to be told there, and it tells us something about what it's like to be a grandfather or what it's like to be a grandchild. Maybe the story that is being told in itself is not 100% true, but it's still the way in which the story is conveyed and why it is conveyed gives us information about the situation in which the storyteller and the listener are engaged. And those can be historical informations too. They're worthy of historical inquiry. And that brings me to the other point about how do we know about the trivial things in life that no one bothered to record? Well, a lot of the times we don't. A lot of the times it is difficult for historians to record the most trivial things because they're not going to go into archives. So a lot of the times we can't, it's very difficult. It's a very difficult thing to do. But there are things that we can extrapolate from stories, mentions of objects, of places, of ways of doing things that were maybe not even central to a story, that are maybe just like mentioned in passing, but that tell you information about the more trivial aspects of daily life. So it's a challenge. It's not. It's difficult, and I think that's maybe one of the reasons why the early. I mean, there are other reasons, but the early post-independent scholars like Bethuel Ogot, in the first books, he doesn't really try to delve into those things. He goes into like a lot of things that are easier to document using oral traditions or other types of material are going to be like wars, pandemics, things like big events that people see as extraordinary. And the ordinary, the texture of daily life, it does get lost. There are ways around it, but I think it does get lost, and it's difficult to get to. I am so glad to hear, Professor Ojwang, that you've made it to Rongai, and I can't wait to talk more about this. And also, thank you so very much for making it today. And I think you're absolutely right about the importance of the digitization of archives, and especially those like less important archival centers that are maybe not the Kenya National Archives. So yeah, it's something that's absolutely critical, and that various have told me about, or that we have discussion about hegemonic languages and local languages. So in fact, the story of English and mission schools in the context that I'm looking at is a very strange one. And the use of English was actually discouraged in mission schools especially in the before the 1930s, because missionaries European missionaries said that English would make their Luo students too proud. Going back to the pride issue. So they were discouraging it because they thought that it would make them too proud. And I mean, what is in that word about pride is something about power, right? That if they spoke the language of the colonial oppressor, the balance of power is leaning too much towards them. So the use of English was discouraged, and the use of Luo was encouraged, which is part of the reason why you find the Church Missionary Society spearheading vernacular publications and starting the Luo Language Committee and doing all those things, because it's in line with their earlier views on what the language policy should be. Now, that changes over time as well. And it changes over time. And in fact, I'm even going to say that I think at some level, it was always a hypocritical kind of stance, because mission schools were also designed to provide staff for the colonial state. And in order to become staff for the colonial state, one needed to know English. So there's a tension there. Like, it's a hegemony, sure, but it's a hegemony. It's a negotiated hegemony that has to satisfy to various interests. And therefore, it's a very paradoxical one. Yeah. All right, and then were the vernacular writers on the side of the non-Christian village. Well, I think they were trying to negotiate a way in between. I think that what they're trying to do is to have some kind of reconciliation between their own upbringing and the Christian villages, enlightened villages that they're being a part of as teenagers. So I think it's a tension that they're probably asking themselves every day, how to reconcile those two words. I don't know that they are in either. I think that they're in an in-between. They're intermediaries in that way. Yeah, something. There's some kind of wrestling. Something. Yes, something like yes. I agree with you completely. And about Gramsci and hegemony and vernacular writing as being part of hegemony, yes, I think so. And I think it's not just a story that's going on in Nyanza. That's kind of part of the broader arguments that I'm hoping to make. Like, this is a global process. It's a global process that's going on in Kenya, but it's going on throughout the African continent. It's going on all the continents, in fact. There's a very, very critical turn in the late 19th century and 20th century, where people turn to writing, obeying to norms that are very specific and very odd about how stories should be told and what matters in telling a story. And I think that vernacular writing, the development of vernacular writing, the idea of vernacular writing is very much a part of that hegemony. I think so. Yeah.
Dominant aspect of our intellectual development, political development, power, what have you. But I think the missionary, although occupying a hegemonic position, also had a purpose. The missionary wanted to change my mind. The missionary wanted to change Mwalimu Bongi's mind. Change Mwalimu Bongi's mind in what way? To convert Mwalimu Bongi from being Jachilo to be Jakristo. From being a dirt man I'm translating directly from Luo. A dirty man or a dat man to a clean man. That was the attitude of the Seventh-day Adventist missionary who was writing those interesting stories. The CMS, what's his name? The CMS guy, Mayor, and then what's the name of the Luo woman at Kamagambo in 1929? The lady, what's her name? You gave me her book. The lady at Kamagambo who was writing in Luo.
Oh yes, the one of the 1930s.
Kaskalen. Was she Kaskalen or something? She was a missionary. Yeah, she was also at Kamagam. And they were writing in Luo, but they were saying, enjoy the story, but don't necessarily believe the magical aspects. So you are kind of split. You had the reader was split in cognitive terms, and it brought about what I might call a schizophrenic approach to reading, the learning of reading material. Yes, so that was a problem. But in the Catholic Church, which is what I wanted to bring in the Roman Catholic Church, they have brought in something called inculturation. Inculturation. And I think Professor Diambo of Philosophy Department knows more about this than myself. But I'm aware of the late, I don't know why I should call him late, Laurenti Magesa. I met him once. And I also met, that was a Catholic missionary. I also met a Maryknoll father who was the Superior General from New York, who spoke perfect Luo. He worked in Tanzania and in Kenya. His name was Michael Kirwen. So in Tanzania, in Musoma, I visited their language school where they taught 4 or 5 different local languages to missionaries who are coming to work in North Mara in Tanzania. So they taught Luo, they taught Kuria, they taught all. So if you go to Mara, just go to Makoko language school and you'll get these manuscripts. So the interesting thing is that the Western missionary is more keen on the vernacular stuff than the local educator, the local pastor, the local scholar, the local researcher. So this is where we are. But the Catholic Church have been talking since the African Synod. They have been talking about inculturation. How do you synchronize? How do you use this traditional belief system and the Catholic belief system and the Western stuff and harmonize it and make sense out of the text, which can be consumed by the reader or the learner or the person who is learning about the history or the theology? That's the most exciting part of it. So inculturation is another word I'm throwing into the basket of hegemony. Thank you.
Thank you, Esek, for your comments. So at this juncture, we'll have a look at what they're saying online. We have very few minutes to get done to wrap up. So we can start at the top, if you can, at the top of the chat. Thanks, Esther. Awesome work from Mwalimkile, who's not here. Scroll a bit down. Okay, the next one. Somebody's asking about, somebody's curious about the intellectuals you spoke about. Was any of them teaching at the university? I think you mentioned Makerere, probably there's a group there. Or was it about mission schools only? Okay, next, somebody saying good presentation. Let's go down again. Somebody saying an excellent piece of work, Esther. Your highlights of Luo history are great. You confirm my pride in being Luo. Wow. Next, thank you, Esther, again. I have a question that goes beyond, a bit beyond what you presented. What were the other people engaged with assembling history? Probably that should be in the depth of your work, but if you have a minute or so, or a second or so, you can say something about that. Can perhaps, sorry, were there any female historians? I bet you mentioned something about Grace Ogot, and I think her works. Hopefully, maybe we can say a word on that. We have a minute or so. Next, somebody from saying something from the Anglican Church about the archives that you brought to the fore during this presentation. I think for those who will be dealing something close to her, you have some archives somewhere to get more material. I think dating back to should be 1906 when the CMC came, I think, to Kenya, if I'm right. So they're saying thank you, and I think they're saying where they're based for those who may be interested. And they're saying that your work is amazing. Thank you, Esther, again for the insightful presentation. Best wishes in your journey as you get done in the coming days. And someone's asking, I'm curious to know why Luo vernacular historiography and not any other language. Why not maybe Kikuyu, Kikamba, the Kegusi, where I come from as well. All right. But I think you mentioned something about your journey in Kampala and about that group that was expelled by Obote in 1970. Probably that got interested in that journey. Okay, that is it. Okay, so maybe. Okay, Malim Kule, if you're hearing us, can you, in a very short, brief manner, say something or a question or comment that you have, Malim Kule?
Asante sana Mwalimu Ndigi. I hope you are able to hear me. Are you guys able to hear me? Hello.
Yes, we are. Go on, Mwalimu. Go on, Mwalimu. Go on, Mwalimu. Go on.
Asante sana, Esther Adhiambo, for a very good presentation and also very educating and illuminating. Now, I want to be able to say that out of all the East African ethnic histories, the Luo ranks the fourth after Kiswahili, Kikuyu, and the Maasai. So it is one of the most written, ethnic histories as we speak today. And all these various scholars, writers, and what have you have written these histories depending on their academic backgrounds and so on and so forth. But then now, you talked about, writings that touch on origins. And we've seen scholars like Bethel Ogot, who in the 60s, in fact, he wrote a PhD. He went to England as a mathematician from Alliance High School and came back as an historian. And I listened to him quite a number of years in a conference in Baringo, and he was narrating to us how that happened and how he ended up writing a history that he did not believe in, so that he can be able to graduate. And then after that, he has been trying to correct what he said that time, but then we find that narrative is one of the base narratives that form Luo historiography, if I may call it that. Now, when it comes to origins, I'm an archaeologist and I've worked in Nyanza, Siaya, all kinds of places. But as you would guess, we look at very old stuff. So we've been looking at Miocene sites all the way up to the Pliocene, the Pleistocene, the Holocene, and so on. Miocene goes back about 15 million years, right, up to now. So when we go to the field and do a camp, we say, well, we are from the Department of History and Archaeology. Villagers would come and say, okay, so what are you going to tell us new after you dig holes in our, chambers and so on and so forth? And I was wondering if we can, because somebody asked really like what constitutes history, what can we be able to do to benefit from other approaches other than the archives about probably maybe genetics, things like paleoclimates, that is climates in the past, archaeology and archaeolinguistics, to be able to figure out whether there is something that can be said to be scientific. For example, if it comes to paleoclimates, I think David Wright published very good research last year, towards the end of the tail of last year, about climatic changes in the Sahara, which may have triggered the expansion of what we now call the Luo towards the west, towards the east, which would be towards the Nile, and then some, moving up and down the river, and that's probably why they are called Nilotes because of the Nile. So that's one. In what ways can we be able to relook at these Luo origins and early history, especially pre-colonial, by use of these other methods, other than the archives? Because personally, I do think that the archives that we use are very Eurocentric, and they miss a lot of other things. I was lucky to be able to work at Mfangano Island, where we have got very nice rock art on the rocks there, and they tell quite interesting stories. But then, you know, the stories that you get there are very different from what archaeology is telling us and what the residents are telling us. And so that is another way of maybe looking at what that is. Now, the second one is, how can historians diversify these methodologies? Or how can historians be able to capture these other new ways of looking at these histories? Because I think maybe there's some kind of over-reliance for the pre-colonial history on archives which are Eurocentric in the first place. How can we be able to diversify that and go to other methods that are accepted historical methods? And that will be able to bring more of what really could be the real history of these ethnic histories, not just the Luo, but also other ethnicities. Okay. Now the third one and the last one is, once we get to know.
Okay, I think just one comment, and then you will respond, and then we bring this to a wrap. We don't have much time. So Dr. Gwana, maybe a comment, a question, and then that will be it for the day.
Esther, thanks very much for your presentation. I have two questions, you can call them comments. You make an effort to distinguish between lineage history, genealogy, ethno-national history, and you're talking of the same Luo. So how do you make those distinctions? And you're writing, you know, a history, so to speak, of the Luo. You mentioned at the end something which you didn't go into about selectivity when writing, or you know, in terms of summarizing your work. So I don't know to what extent your work is answering your question of selectivity, and how that is going to affect your own work and has affected other people's work in terms of research and writing. Thank you.
I'm going to try to make one comment that sort of addresses most of a lot of the questions. This is going to be a big comment, but to cover a bit everything. So about the question of selectivity and how my own work is trying to address that, and also the question that was about sources other than archives, diversifying methodologies, and the question that was about what about other people, and especially perhaps female actors, their place in that story. Well, I think that especially for the 19th century segment of my work, which is going to be my chapter 1 of the things that I'm hoping to do, that I'm planning to do in the next few months, is to do shrine history. Shrine history because there are a number of shrines along the lake shores and even in the interior that are associated with particular narratives, and that those narratives have not always been put in history books because they don't always fit in what we think of as history, but they certainly convey a lot of information about the past. They've been used for a very long time. And I'm also inspired by the work of my own supervisor. So one of my supervisors is David Schönbrunn, and he works on Buganda. And he has worked on the history of shrines along the lake shores, not here, not in the Winan Belt, but on that other side. And I do believe that some of the shrines have a lake story rather than just a landed story. So I want to borrow from his methodology to try to do something about shrine history to reconstruct part of the 19th century, and I'm hoping that this gives a history that is not really ethnic based, or that is not really just about the Luo, and that goes a bit beyond the story about lineages. A way of thinking about the past that has a different kind of view, and that was fulfilling different kinds of purposes. So that's how I'm thinking about going about it at this stage of my research. Maybe it's going to be a disaster and I'm just going to do something else. But that's the plan, at least that's the plan. And one last thing that I want to say about archives. One of the things that I found most rewarding was to work with archivists who are struggling to make their archives visible. This includes Jelius, who I believe was probably online from the Anglican Church archives, which are on Bishop Road. So I'm going to advertise for him. Some of their documents go as far as the 19th century. And there, I've personally found completely by mistake with Jelius, a biography about an enslaved person that was written in the 1880s. That was one of the earliest documents that we found. But so there are some, and that story was never published. It's just there at the archives. So yeah, like there are also really interesting, even just doing archival research, there are interesting things that we find, interesting people we meet, and interesting things we encounter that are still worth doing. And including at Makerere University, which is very closely connected to that story, not just because vernacular historiographers went there, but because the generation that came after, people like Betuelo Got, were also there and also became very inspired by things that they were studying from Makerere. All right, so I think I'm going to stop here because we're running out of time. Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Esther, for all you've done for us this afternoon, for the beautiful presentation. Thank you, the audience, for making a time to be here. Thank you, people in the online platform, for being able to tune in. This brings us to the end of this, but our colleague, Joseph Ogutu, will give a vote of thanks to wrap up everything for the day. And you're welcome for the next one. 2 weeks from today. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. So my name is Joseph Owino, and I'm happy to have this chance to do the conclusion of today's presentation. Now, when Esther began her presentation, I came up with 2 variables to measure whether she's really a 20th century historian in terms of historiography. Now, the 2 variables were as follows. The first one is in terms of the thematic areas she's dealing with. And secondly, in terms of methodology. Now, I would like to say that I really appreciate Esther's work because first, she has turned the spotlight on social issues seldom addressed by historians. And in this case, she has drifted from the normal political issues, issues of nationalism, to focus on social history of how Luos have actually documented their history. Now, methodologically, she has analyzed various sources of historical works written in vernacular in Luo Nyanza. Now, thank you for that. Indeed, you're a true 21st century historian because you are conscious of the elements of historiography, that is in terms of themes and methodology. Indeed, in the 21st century, the scope of historical inquiry is very broad and social issues are now being given due attention that for a very long period of time have been trivialized. So we want to see this kind of work going on in these debates. Secondly, I want to ask the following historiographical questions from your work. That is the documenting of vernacular history in Luo, the Luo. So I said the Luo, right? Now, the first one is this. From my understanding of work, I was very keen. the Luos were writing their history with an aim of documenting the past or historical experiences and transmitting the same to the future generation. And again, I'll ask this question: was vernacular history by the Luos scientific? Who can respond to that? Okay, so maybe that can be answered in future. So thank you so much for the wonderful work. Chair, thank you so much for organizing this seminar. And let's proceed in that same note in future. Thank you so much.